Okay, so horsehair. Now we've done the canvas. The next thing is the horsehair. We use the same canvas that we cut out to also cut the shape out of our horsehair. Sometimes this, depending on what type of horsehair you have, the grain of the horsehair, so the weft of the horsehair, which is the direction where the hairs are woven, is not always perfectly perpendicular to the selvage. Now, as you can see, this is going slightly on an angle. So what I would normally do is I would make sure that I cut along one of these hairs perfectly straight. Then I would try to take one of these, hairs out. And if you can take one hair out all the way to the top without it kind of like break or, distort here, it means that your cut is on the straight grain, perfectly straight on the grain. Then what I do is I take my L square or any other, L-shaped ruler that you have, and I just draw, let's say I draw this straight line here with my chalk on my board, and I make sure that that line is perpendicular to the edge of my board. Or what I could also do is just to use that same line and just draw a line perpendicular to it. So I have a square here in the corner of my board. Then what I do is I align this grain, which is now supposedly perfectly cut on the straight, and I align it with this line that I just drew with the ruler. And I also make sure that the edge of my horsehair here is now matching the other line. So if I want to clear this out, smooth this out, I can see it's slightly going, sideways, and then it has a curve. It's not perfectly straight. So what I do is I put a weight on it, and you can do this without weights as well. It just means that you have to go back and forwards a little bit more. But weights, if you just put an old book on it if you don't have weights, or some, you must have something heavy around you if you don't have weights. And I make sure that everything is aligned. Then, I just do like a first kind of like first pressing, nothing really special, just to make sure it kind of like heats up and takes out the wrinkles, and it just smooths it out so that I can see exactly what the grain is doing. So then after that, you can see it's kind of like going, a bit like, dodgy. So I try to straighten the grain in the areas that I see are not really going that perfectly straight. And I use the tip of my fingers and my nails just to shift things over. So this one goes that way, that one goes this way. I can straighten things out. And I start usually from the middle. Then what I would do is I would spray some water on top of it. And make sure when you're working on horsehair, you have a hot iron. And, when I say a hot iron, it doesn't mean like, you burn through your board. A domestic iron can get hot as well. Just make sure you don't have it on the low stand. You can have it on the hottest stand, and it will be fine. So then I try to kind of like make sure at least the middle point is going perfectly straight. And I just gently put the iron over it and make sure that I dry that out. Now you can see, it's funny. This is dead straight, this is dead straight, and now I have surplus in the middle. So what am I going to do with it? Well, I'm going to have to see how much of this surplus is really surplus, because sometimes, it sorts itself out. But it seems for us that we have some surplus that we have to get out of our edge. So so what would happen if I would let go of these weights? You have to then assess how much everything is distorting. So it seems to be fine so far. I'll make sure I continue a little bit more down the line. And one of the nice things about working with canvases is the smell they have. It smells organic. It has this animalistic kind of like cattle kettle smell. And you know, that's one of the things that makes tailoring recognizable, and those are the things that you usually miss when you know, don't sew anything, is the scent of the fabric when it gets pressed. So now I think it looks fairly okay. So if I would align this once more, just to see if it actually has been corrected, and just try to gently lay this. So that's matching, that's fine. Okay, so now there is, you know, a little less distortion without my interference, and that seems fine. Just make sure, because sometimes, you know, these are spun very quickly and wrapped around, and sometimes, you know, the hairs distort, and you never know what happens. You know, it's not that people are rolling these up, you know, perfectly neat. It all happens on the machine. Now, let's do the first, you know, type of canvas, which was our basic canvas. And before we actually get to cut it out, I'm going to give you some explanation on what to do with the shape of our horsehair. Now, the shape of the horsehair is going to be pretty much exactly the same as this area, apart from the fact that it's going to have this round curve. So before we actually mark all the other pieces, you know, it's better to mark that curve. You have a reference point here, which is your dart. Now, this dart, maybe depending on the draft that you use, is going to be very high or very low, or just in the right place. Don't think about the dart, although I am going to use this dart as a reference point, but understand the principle behind it. You do not want the horsehair to get too close to the waistline where the suppression is, okay? Because if that happens and you move back and forwards and you sit down or whatever you do, your jacket is going to break around this area. It's going to collapse both on the front and the side. So keep the chest, the horsehair, well away from, you know, far away from the suppression. The horsehair is there to support the chest. It's also called the chest piece, you know, or chest hair. So yeah, get the chest hair above the waist, and make sure it's not really near your dart. So what I'm going to do is I usually, you know, depending on my own dart position, which is usually consistent, I measure about 1.5 inches to 1.75 inches. So as for now, I'm going to do 1.5 inches, which is the equivalent of about 4 centimeters. So if I mark that, then all I need to do is to curve this into there. And if you notice, I don't bring this all the way to the side. I kind of like leave 3/8, which is a centimeter, away from this edge, so that I, you know, smoothly go into there. And then the next thing is eventually, once we have canvassed the jacket, so this means when the fabric is on top of the canvas and the canvas is already made up, our horsehair gets trimmed back about 3/8 behind the break line. This is the break line where the lapel breaks and folds over. The reason for that is that if we have the horsehair on the break line, it sometimes pushes the lapel a bit more forward, and it doesn't really allow it to sit on the crease that it should sit on, and therefore it kind of like doesn't run nicely into the undercolor. So that's why we keep it away from the break line, so that there is no horsehair. And you know, horsehair is very stiff. So if you have it over the break line, or, you know, just on the break line, you may not be able to crease the top part of your lapel where it transitions into the collar, and to, you know, have that smooth transition into a roll. Therefore, we keep it away. But when we are cutting the horsehair at this stage, we leave a little bit of extra, so that by the time we have padded the canvas and we have taken some darts out and we have canvassed the jacket, we have a break line or a cut line that exactly resembles the break line of the forepart, which is the fabric pattern that we have cut out. So that's the one that's going to be dictating where this eventually is going to go. Because, you know, you're going to put darts into this, and maybe this break line ever so slightly distorts. So you don't want that horsehair not to run perfectly along the break line in that case. So I would imagine that when it's finished, it's going to be behind the brake line, just to draw my curve here. But like I said, I'm going to cut a little bit more. So now that I know that curve, I can extend this a little bit more. And it's going to be about 5/8, which is 1.5 centimeters. You don't need more than that. And there is also another reason why I leave a little bit extra, which I'm going to explain to you during the canvassing stage. So that's going to be that. And the rest is going to be pretty much exactly the same. Do make sure that the direction of the horsehair is, parallel to the weft of your canvas, because it's going to go horizontal for this model. Yeah, that's it. So now the question is, how are we going to lay this on top of our horsehair? Well, this really depends. You see, I'm now doing 2 different sides. So what I have to do is to either, I can either position it like that, or position it like that, or position it like that, or position it like that. Normally, I try to keep this straight line, which I've cut, around this bottom of my chest piece, my chest hair. And I try to get this brake line as close as I can to the selvage. Now, sometimes if you're cutting double, you can also do the opposite. You can bring this down if you don't have a big shoulder piece, and offset the other one the other way around, like we did on the canvases. I would say there is no fixed way to put this, as long as your grain is matching that grain line that it should match, which is in this case, horizontal, parallel to the weft of the canvas, or perpendicular to the warp. Then you're fine. Just make sure, just like the striking out, lay them so that you are left over with as much horsehair as possible, in case you want to add extra pieces here and there and experiment with that. So as for now, I will be placing this like so. And again, don't forget to soak your horsehair and soak your chest hair and allow it to shrink. Although this type of horsehair doesn't shrink that much, because hair doesn't shrink. It's more maybe the cotton in between. But still, it's a good idea to do that, because if anything happens, it's not going to be a good effect, especially with a rigid material like that. So now all you need to do is very simple. Is first of all, find your pen. Now, all I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to mark around the body here, like that, the contours of the canvas. Okay, now I'm going to mark where my horsehair, where my brake line is. So I'm going to put a mark right here, and I'm also going to put a mark. If you just put a pin on your brake line and lift your canvas up, you will know exactly where you can put your pattern. Or if you have marked it on both sides like I have done, then you can just put that on the crease. So that's fine. Now we need to transfer this shape, and that's fairly easy. All you need to do is to put your ruler on top, just mark a few dots here and there, make sure your canvas doesn't move. And you have the curve. So that's our curve. Now, you may not be able to see it perfectly, but if I would just mark it here for you. You should be able to see that. Now, then of course we have to mark our brake line. And this is our actual brake line. And now, once I've done that, then I'm going to add that extra 5/8 or 1.5 centimeters. This, again, I hate giving measures. It could be 1/2 inch, but nothing less than 1/4, because horsehair is going to be very difficult to chalk the way we're going to chalk it after we have canvassed, which you're going to see. But leave a little bit extra so you can actually lift up this edge, because if this is too short, it's very difficult to lift that up and mark a line with the chalk underneath it. So just leave that little bit extra. Now, that's our horsehair. Done. Basic, super simple. Let me just cut this out, and we're going to do the other one. Now, once you've cut this out, if you have two sides, so let's say I'm going to have only one side on this jacket, but if you're making a jacket in this style and you're making both of the four parts the same, hold on, let me just get this sucker down. If you're making them the same, then I would suggest that once you mark the other one out by using the same pattern, so imagine I'm going to cut another one of this out, I'm just going to lay this on top now, use the same horsehair. However, make sure that when you lay them next to each other, you have this line that represents your break line mirrored on the other one, so that you don't end up with two sides marked on the same side and then you do something wrong. Always work in a way whereby if you would put them opposing each other or opposite each other, they reflect the markings of one another if they should be symmetrical. So this is our basic model. So again, same process. I have to straighten the grain, make sure that I have enough. Spray some water on it and straighten out these grains starting from the center. Sometimes, the edges really go sideways. In that case, it's just best to spray it, put some tension on it, and allow the iron to set it. Spray it again, see if it contracts back. If it doesn't, then you're fine. Because it shouldn't really go, in a curve around the edges. That's just something that's happened during the rolling up and packaging process. So now with the other one, for the pagoda shoulder, if you remember, what we did was we drew a line and we cut that away, which was just the shoulder piece, and we cut a new shoulder piece which was cut on the bias. Now, if I would cut my horsehair so that this area was going to be like the other one, parallel to the weft of the canvas, so that the horsehair would, run along the chest line, then what I would have to do is to cut the horsehair exactly like the canvas. So, make a cut there, probably offset the cut so both cuts don't end up on top of each other, and then cut the shoulder piece on the bias. But because of the reasons I explained, it's far more efficient and actually style-wise a lot nicer and more flattering to cut the entire horsehair on the bias, so that it's on the bias on the shoulder and it's on the bias on the chest area. So that's what I'm going to do. However, to make things easier for myself, I can do this is basically what I'm going to do. First, decide on your bias direction. Now, the bias grain is going to be determined by this shoulder piece that you have. So if I would lay this on the bias according to the shoulder piece, I would first have to get this going like so, and then adjust the shoulder piece to that, like this. So first get the grain matching the grain of the shoulder, and then bring your lines together and see how, whether you're, laying this in a bad way or in a good way. Now, it's obviously not really the most economical way, so maybe I should try to do that in the other way. I can also just allow the grain of the shoulder to follow through into the canvas so that I can just get the canvas, move it around, knowing where the grain should be, and find the best possible way to position this. Now, obviously, one thing you have to keep in mind is now, because I'm doing two different ways, they don't really puzzle and fit into one another. But if you would cut both of them exactly the same, one would be offset against the other one. So they more or less use less material than I'm using now. So just keep that in mind. So again, this has to be 1.5 inches above. Okay, so again, I would do exactly the same as I did before. Mark around the edges. And you don't need to leave any extra horsehair around the shoulders because you've already allowed for that in the pattern shape of the canvas when you laid your fabric. So no need to add any extra pieces. So then I would mark the break line here because I have that mark now. That's just simply going to continue into there. And I'm going to mark the break line here. Now, don't be afraid. This is not going to be all waste. You know, these can be used as bias pieces that sometimes you can put in the shoulder area to reinforce the shoulder, or you can use them when you're making shoulder pads or any other area that you would like to stabilize using a horsehair. So don't throw these away. They're not useless. You can do a lot of things with them, and I use them all the time. So again, I can add this and now cut that away. Okay, so now if we compare the two, we can see the difference. So in our basic model, the horsehair is running along the chest line. Whereas on the pagoda model, the horsehair is running from one shoulder end roughly towards the first button area. Now, if you would push this basic model from the side, and this is basically how it would wrap around the body, you can see that there is, you know, a predictable resistance in that direction, and it just, you know, creates this nice roundness. Whereas with this one, if you would try to bend this, first of all, you're going to meet some resistance, but you also are immediately are going to notice this concave line, which I previously explained. So if I would try to fold this, it very quickly wants to push everything to the front. And, you know, here you can see this concaveness. Now, once this is padded to the canvas, that concaveness is going to be around this area as well, but not so much around this area because this area gets worked and stretched with the iron. So that's going to lose that concaveness. But especially in the chest area, you're going to have that concave line. And that is what really allows that elegant hourglass silhouette to manifest itself. Now, just to do a recap with you. We have our pagoda model, which has the canvas cut on the straight grain, just like our fabric, but it has the shoulder piece cut separately. And this line, as you remember, was going from the point just above the armhole that we marked to where the gorge and the brake line intersect or meet. So that's that line. You can make that maybe smaller or slightly wider, but I wouldn't bring it any lower because it's only really for the shoulder, armhole, and neck area. You don't really need that there. So that's a good position to transition that away. And then for the horsehair, we have the chest piece, the chest hair, also on the bias in the shoulder area, but also on the bias in the chest area. And so by the time we pad this, you're going to notice this hollowness here, especially if you're holding it up yourself. And that's going to allow the chest to move forward like so and keep this all hollow. And for the basic model, we have a different canvas, and that's going to be all the way cut on the straight grain, and the horsehair is going to run parallel to the chest line. We then are going to make a cut in this area, and once we've made the cut, we're going to open that up, and that's our piece. Now, if you remember, we also had this extra piece prepared so that we can use for this canvas here. But we also need an extra piece for the horsehair because we're going to open the horsehair up and we're going to machine that up. So I have exactly the same piece in horsehair, which on one side runs on the straight grain, and the other side is going to be whatever it is. But it has to be on the straight grain because by the time you put that here, you want this, you open the cut up in that direction. So you want this to be strong enough in between there so it doesn't collapse. If you cut it this way, that's going to collapse very easily, and you're going to just continuously have a break in your shoulder. But you really want the force of the horsehair to be present between those two and act as a bridge. So do keep that in mind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark exactly what I marked on the canvas piece here. And like I said, you don't need to have a pattern master to do this. Any curve that is going to be the same on the other side is sufficient. You want consistency, that's all. So basically what I did, I knew that the depth of the cut is going to be 3.5 inches from the actual shoulder line, which is about 9 centimeters. And I will open that up about 1.25 inches, so I mark that. And then I draw this curve and allow that to fade in or fade out, and that's it. Very simple and very basic. Now, let's move on to make the cut on this particular shoulder here. Right, now let's just talk a little bit more about this shoulder shape on the canvases, because I don't want to just start doing things and you thinking, oh, I'm missing something. So we've cut the canvases, we've cut the horsehair. The horsehair was fairly simple, exactly the same shape as the canvas, except for this curve here, which was 1.5 inches, about 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters above my waistline here. Maybe your dart starts here, but as long as you understand that this shouldn't get too close to the suppression of the jacket, which is more or less on the side, then that's fine. It's only for the chest area. And also that this is later going to be cut away behind the brake line, but we cut it so that it's going to be over the brake line until we have padded and done the rest. Now on this basic model, we have to make this opening here so that it produces this extra room for the arm to move in. This also adds comfort and style to some extent. So what do we do? Well, when we are going to base this together and then later on pad it, we already have marked our brake line here, right? Remember when I said make sure that if you're cutting twice the same of this shape, like the basic model, make sure they are mirrored. Well, you're going to use this line. So if you have two on the same line, you may get confused and make 2 times right side or 2 times left side. That's a very easy mistake to make, and I definitely have done that. And not only in the beginning stages, but I sometimes still do it. So it depends on where your mind is at that moment. So basically, if I'm going to lay this break line on top of this break line, then I'm matching exactly that shape that I drew with the chalk here, okay? You can see it. The edge meets the edge of the chalk line. Fine. However, we're going to make a cut. Then we're going to open this cut and we're going to machine this piece underneath that cut so that that keeps the cut open, okay? If I would do just an example for you. It's as if we're going to cut this open like so and then open this up. You can see what happens here. Okay? And then we're going to put this piece underneath it and we're going to machine and then we're going to trim all the excess at the back. So that excess creates bulk. We don't want the bulk or the seams of those two cuts, both from the horsehair and the canvas, to fall exactly on top of each other. We want them to be offset so that when you run your hand over it, you don't feel a big lump. You feel maybe two small lumps because, you know, feeling a lump there is going to be inevitable. So what do? Well, very basic. You know that if you match your horsehair break line with the break line of your canvas, your shape is going to be exactly where it should be. Okay? So if we want to make the cut and we want to offset everything, all you need to do is the following. We have this line here already, right? Now, you can either move your horsehair backwards to the left or forwards to the right, okay? By roughly 3/8 or 1 centimeter. But do it parallel to this edge. Don't shift it over like that. So if this is now matching, all I'm going to do is I'm going to use this allowance that I've put here, the edge of that allowance, and I'm going to move this back. So now you notice that if I move this sideways, my break line is not matching anymore, okay? And my side curve here is not matching my chalk line. So that means the whole thing is offset. All I need to do now is to mark my line that I have on the canvas. So this is one point here and this is the other point. So mark it while it's offset. And then cut both of them at the same time. What you're doing is you're actually cutting your original line whilst having your horsehair offset. So by the time you match your break line again, this cut is going to move slightly forwards to the cut of your canvas. Therefore, your seams and your cuts are not going to end up exactly on the same point. So let's go ahead and do that. That's it, okay? So now we have a cut there. Now, if I bring this forward and match my break line with the break line of the canvas, whoops, it's got stuck there. So if I would match that like so, you can see that this cut is now offset. And therefore, once we get that extra bulk, by the time we sew that extra piece in or wedge that in, our bulk or seam allowances are not going to be exactly on top. Sometimes if you have to think, always think how you can do something in the most efficient way without compromising on quality. And if you have developed a habit that has been working for you in the past, designate a time for yourself, let's say every once in a month, every once in 2 months, twice a year, whatever works for you, to reassess every single technique in the most rigorous way to make sure you're improving. Just because something is working for you doesn't mean that it's the best way. Imagine how much better you could be if you would spend the time to really reassess everything according to your criteria and make sure that every year you have become that little bit more efficient, that little bit more accurate, that little bit more, let's say, stylized, and just work your way through everything you're doing. Don't fall in love with your own ideas. So if, for example, you come up with an idea and you're like, oh, this is an improvement that I've made now, nobody does this, don't think that that is the best way. It could be an improvement, and it may be, but there is always going to be another improvement which is going to be better than this one. So always keep that in mind, please, please, please. So that's that. Now all we need to do is now put this wedge in, and now it all makes sense why we have drawn this line, because when we go under the machine, we place this point that we have stopped our cutting line right on that point. We align that with this here, and then we open this other one up according to our line. So if this is just going, you know, opened up straight, then you just get like this straight shape there, and it's just going to be there. But because this is slightly curved, as you curve this around and you curve this all the way around, it's going to force that to kind of like, well, let me just exaggerate. You open this up just straight, it's going to just go up there. But if you open this up in a curve, what's going to happen is it's going to force that to stay up and keep up and have this concave shape. So it's going to really give the effect of a forward shoulder, which looks extremely sexy in a jacket. And whether it's a men's jacket or a woman's jacket, it's going to look very elegant. So that's the basic of it. Now, the other thing that I mentioned to you is that make sure that the horsehair has the grain going in that direction. Basically, have one edge on the selvage and the other one going through it, is for this following reason. When you lay this on top to sew, just like you did on the canvas, you want the direction of the horsehair to be more or less a continuation of the piece that you have here, so that the force is acting as a bridge between these two cuts. This doesn't really easily collapse in this direction. It's very bouncy in this direction. However, if you make the mistake to, for example, cut it in this direction, like that, and you open this up, this just, you know, you can see I can just pinch it. It just breaks in that area. That's not going to be very good. So always make sure that your horsehair is connecting. It's as if you're matching a horizontal stripe to both cut edges. So it runs from here, goes to there, and then goes to the other one. Always have the strength of the horsehair in the middle. So that's for the shoulder of the basic model. Now, I'm going to start with the horsehair. It doesn't really matter. You can start with the canvas as well. There's really no difference. And I'm using a dark brown thread so that it's more visible what I'm doing. So we have our cut, and we have our piece that we're going to use as our guide to get hypothetically exactly the same on both sides. So what I do is I start from the side that is going to fall on the straight line, which is closer to the break line. I'm going to just shift this over, flip this over, should I say, and place the starting point of my cut on the starting point where I marked, which is that little dot there, like so. So then allow it to lay on top of your line. And now our actual shoulder line is roughly around here, because that's the 3.5 deep depth that we marked. So keep everything in place. Get the thread out of the way. Put this underneath the machine. Then you're going to align. You're going to align everything so that you are 1 foot's width away from this edge. So you align this edge with the edge of this foot here, okay? So and as you machine, make sure that you hold everything in place so that things don't move, and continue from there. As you get closer to the point here of where your cut starts. Close the cut again, machine a little bit further, and then curve into a point, an imaginary point that's about 3/8 lower, so than the starting point of your cut. So once I see that this point of my machine foot is aligned with the base of my cut, I'm gonna curve slightly inwards until I'm below the line, or below the point of my cut, and I flip this over like so, and then curve my way back up so that my machine foot is aligned with my cutting edge. So this edge aligned to the cutting edge, like that. So now they are in line, and then from this point on I'm going to start opening this wedge. And as I'm going, I'm aligning my horsehair with that slight curve that I drew, so that it forces the shape in the top part of the shoulder. So that's that. And if we would just have a look at it, so you can now see that we started there. We're only like 5 millimeters away from this edge. We started there, we went down into a point, and then went all the way up, and at the same time we've opened this wedge now. So if you look from the back, we have this extra nonsense here, you know, horsehair, that we have to trim away. We're going to do that later when we get to the board. So let me just do the other one, which is going to be the canvas. So same thing. You start with your cut closed, you flip the shoulder side over, you align the starting point of your cut with the wedge, like that. Keep everything underneath there, and start sewing. And same thing here. Just before I go up, I keep the dart or the cut closed, curve inwards, and then from here on I'm going to sew along my line. So that's it. So exactly the same. The horsehair and the canvas are going to be exactly the same. Now, since there is a little bit of a curve, you can see this creates this concave shape there, which starts from nothing and then curves forwards, as you can see here. It's not just you know, going up like that. It's slightly curving forwards, which is that shoulder shape that you want to achieve. And you don't just achieve these things with the shoulder pad. You have to really build the construction inside your canvas, because the canvas will dictate to the fabric. And then when you look from the back again, you have all this excessive canvas that we're going to trim away later on. So that's the basic model. Now for the pagoda shoulder, it's going to be similar, just a little bit simpler, because we only do it once and we don't need to mark much. So what we need to do is we need to sew this to this, but we're not going to do like a traditional seam where, you know, sew behind and then press open the seam, because that's just going to create this bulk across that chest. So what we do is we take our lining and I haven't cut the linings yet, because I'd like to do that on the next series. So first of all, we have to know where the straight grain of this lining is. Now, luckily, I can see where the straight grain of this lining is, and make a cut across along the straight grain. And the reason why I'm not being very fussy for it to be exactly on the straight grain is because we're going to machine on top of it. It's not going to be something like a front edge. So I'm just going to cut this piece a little bit more in along the grain and just cut this here. Then what I'm going to do is, when I get on the machine, I'm going to put this underneath the jacket or the canvas, align the straight edge with the bias edge, because we don't want this cut area to stretch out. We want that to be in place, and therefore it has to be on the straight grain so that it's kind of like quite strong. So put this there. We're going to machine one like foot's width away from the edge. Then we're going to put this on top, machine another foot's width away from this edge, flip it back, trim the excess lining, and then do a zigzag. And you have to do it so that the lining ends up on the side that's going to face the fabric, not on the inside, because you don't want that to kind of like have no lining. You can put maybe another lining on that side, but it's not really going to be necessary. You're just going to make that area a bit more stiff or rigid, and you don't want that. You don't want that to happen. So that's that. Very simple. Now let's go on and do that, and just sit on the machine and talk you through that. All we need to do is to take our cut edge on which we're going to sew the shoulder piece, take our lining, put the cut edge on the lining like so, get this thread out of the way, and align the edge of this foot with the edge of our canvas, and sew. Now when you sew, we have this tendency to pull things or put tension on things when we're sewing, but because this is on the bias, you definitely don't want to be doing that. So make sure you keep the straight grain along this cut edge, and prevent any kind of stretching from happening. So once you've done that, you don't need to take your needle out. You can just stitch a few lines towards yourself and prepare for the other side. So now, if you remember, we mark these pen marks just to make sure that by the time we're finished, they more or less align on the lines that they should. And we're going to make sure that that happens. So again, now what you need to do is you need to kind of like push these against each other. So just make sure that there is no gap between them. You really want these to be kissing each other, as they say. Okay, so now that you've machined, it's going to look something like this, just two rows of stitching. What you need to do is to trim the excess away so that we can do the zigzag. Now, you can do this with any type of scissor, by the way. This is not necessarily the scissor to do this for, but I find this one very handy to work with. Okay, so now for the zigzag. What you need to know about the zigzag is that on top of your machine, you have this tension spring. Now, when you open this up, it releases the tension that is there on the foot. So the higher this screw is going to be, the lower the tension on the foot. When we are doing the zigzag, you definitely want two things to happen. You want your machine to be set up correctly so that the way the threads interlock is not unbalanced. And you definitely want to make sure that this screw is made loose, so that by the time you are doing your zigzag, you don't have to pull too much on your fabric. So I'm doing the zigzag so I can see the raw edge, because I don't want the raw edge to fold back over itself. So what I do is I make sure I leave a little bit lining on the end here, and I also make sure that my canvas is not falling down from my board, so it's not going in directions that I don't want it to go. And then keep your cut edge perpendicular to the foot of the machine, so that all you need to do is to drag your hand sideways, and that is going to continue. So this is what you're going to do. You also have this reverse handle here. On some of the newer machines, they all have the spring, so when you put this down, it automatically goes back up. This one doesn't have it, and I quite like that, because it gives me control to just be very precise with it, and that's that. So what you're going to do is you're going to sew, and as you're sewing, you're going to pull sideways while you move this up and down, up and down, up and down. But you're going to have to keep a rhythm in it. So also, how much you press the pedal in of your machine is important. So you don't want to just start sewing away all the way up to here. You want to keep this tension that you're putting on the left here consistent with the rhythm that you have here. Okay? So let's try to do that. Once you've done a few stitches, you can hold very close to your canvas and go forwards and backwards. And then once you've done a couple of stitches, get close to it again. Don't let it go all the way, because you're going to lose control. So always keep close to your canvas. So once you do that, you get this zigzag effect, and on the other side it looks something like this. What you want is to make sure that when you do the zigzag, you go just a stitch over the edge of the lining. Now it's sometimes difficult to do that, but when you look at your sewing edges, these two parallel lines, make sure you always go 1 or 2 stitches over them, so that you catch the edges of your lining as well. This way you minimize the chance of this lining, starting to fray all over the place. So I've just used the darker thread so that you can see everything, and if there is any distortions, which we fortunately don't have at this moment, it would be visible. So now let's move on to basting on the horsehair.